Mason Hayes volunteered at Willow Creek Animal Shelter every weekend, finding peace among abandoned pets that others had forgotten. His large hands surprisingly gentle with the smallest creatures. When elderly neighbor Diane Foster called about strange, pained whimpers coming from the Whitmore property at the edge of town, Mason's casual visit revealed a sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. 8 months passed as authorities dismissed the case as ordinary animal neglect, another sad footnote in the town's history. Then Mason discovered hidden surveillance tapes in Preston's abandoned shed, revealing acts of cruelty so methodical and calculated that the footage made his blood run cold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Willow Creek. Montana was the kind of small town where everyone claimed to know everyone else's business. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests that turned brilliant shades of amber and gold each fall, Main Street consisted of little more than a diner, hardware store, post office, and a sheriff's department that hadn't seen serious crime in decades. It was a place where people left their doors unlocked at night and waved to passing cars, even if they didn't recognize the driver. Mason Hayes had returned to his hometown 3 years ago after 12 years of military service left him with a Purple Heart, chronic back pain, and nightmares that woke him in cold sweats. At 38, his once clean-shaven face now carried a neatly trimmed beard peppered with premature gray, hiding scars both visible and invisible. He'd built a modest cabin on the outskirts of town, where the nearest neighbor was just close enough to wave to but far enough to give him the space his fractured mind needed. Emily, his high school sweetheart and wife of 9 years, had died in a car accident while he was on his second deployment. Her passion for animal rescue had inspired Mason to volunteer at the local shelter, where he found that caring for creatures who had suffered helped quiet his own demons. The shelter staff appreciated his patience with the most traumatized animals, the ones that cowered or snapped when approached. "They just need someone who understands fear," he would say with a sad smile. The Whitmore family had owned half the construction business in the county for generations. James Whitmore, with his tailored suits and campaign donations, sat on the town council and chaired the Chamber of Commerce. His son Preston had always been different, quieter, more intense, with a coldness in his eyes that made mothers pull their children closer when he passed. While most folks attributed his oddness to losing his mother young, others whispered about cruelty to neighborhood pets when he was a boy, though no one ever said such things above a whisper. Diane Foster had lived next door to the Whitmores for 40 years. At 67, arthritis had slowed her steps, but her hearing remained sharp as ever, and her moral compass even sharper. She had been the first to call Mason about the sounds like something dying but slowly. She'd said, her voice trembling over the phone, "Something that's lost hope of rescue." The day Mason received Diane's call started like any other. He had spent the morning replacing rotten boards on his porch, the repetitive work of hammer and nail providing the rhythm that kept his thoughts anchored in the present. When his phone buzzed in his pocket, he almost didn't answer, reluctant to break the calm he had carefully constructed around himself. "Mason, it's Diane Foster." Her voice wavered slightly, the way it did when she was upset but trying to remain composed. "I hate to bother you, but I've been hearing these sounds from Preston's place for 3 nights now. Not just barking, whimpering, like an animal in real pain. I called the sheriff yesterday, but you know how Bob is about the Whitmores." Mason sighed, setting down his hammer. Sheriff Thompson was a good man in most ways. but his friendship with James Whitmore stretched back to childhood, creating blind spots in his usually sound judgment. "What kind of sounds exactly, Diane?" "Like something trapped. Crying. Sometimes there's scratching. I thought maybe a wild animal got caught somewhere. But—" She paused, lowering her voice, though no one else could hear her. "Preston's been carrying food to that old shed behind his house. The one with the new padlock." Mason rubbed his temple, feeling the familiar tension building. He had promised himself to stay clear of other people's problems, to focus on his own healing. But Diane had brought him soup every week for a month after he returned to Willow Creek, never asking questions when he couldn't maintain conversation. "I'll drive by, take a look," he said finally. "But, Diane, if it's nothing, we leave it alone." "All right. Bless you, Mason. I just couldn't bear another night listening to that suffering." Preston's house sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, a well-maintained Victorian that looked oddly pristine against the overgrown yard surrounding it. Mason drove past slowly, noting Preston's black pickup wasn't in the driveway. He parked down the road, approaching on foot through a line of spruce trees that offered some cover. The shed stood about 50 yards behind the house, newer than Mason expected, with a metal roof and a heavy-duty padlock securing the door. As he got closer, the sound became unmistakable, the weak whine of a dog in distress, punctuated by labored breathing. Mason circled the building, finding a small, dirt-smudged window near the back. Standing on his toes, he peered through a corner not covered by the dark material taped across the inside. What he saw made his stomach clench. A German shepherd lay on a filthy concrete floor, its ribs protruding so severely they looked like they might pierce through the skin. Patches of fur were missing, revealing inflamed skin covered with scabs and open sores, particularly along its back and hindquarters. A short chain secured the dog to a bolt in the floor, offering barely enough length to stand and turn around. Mason's military training took over. He found a rock, wrapped his jacket around his hand, and broke the window as far from the dog as possible. The animal didn't even flinch at the sound of breaking glass, a bad sign. Using a fallen branch, Mason managed to push enough of the dark material aside to create a gap he could fit through. Inside, the stench of waste and infection hit him like a physical force. The dog lifted its head weakly as Mason approached, retreating as far as its chain would allow, pressing itself into the corner with its tail tucked tightly underneath. Despite its fear, there was no growling, no bared teeth, just resignation in eyes that had long ago stopped expecting kindness. "Hey, buddy," Mason said softly, crouching down several feet away. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog watched him warily, its breathing shallow and rapid. Mason noticed water and food bowls both empty except for a film of slime. Slowly, he removed a water bottle from his pocket, pouring some into his cupped hand and offering it from a distance. Minutes passed in silence. Then, with trembling legs, the dog inched forward until it could stretch its neck to lap weakly at the water in Mason's palm. Something in Mason's chest tightened at this small display of trust from a creature with every reason to trust no one. The sound of tires on gravel broke the moment. Mason looked through the window to see Preston's black pickup turning into the driveway. Quickly, he examined the chain securing the dog, finding it attached to a padlock that matched the one on the door. He wouldn't have time to free the animal before Preston discovered the break-in. "I'll be back," Mason promised, giving the dog a final, gentle touch on its head. The animal didn't cower this time. instead keeping its eyes fixed on Mason with an intensity that seemed to convey understanding. Mason slipped back through the window just as Preston's truck door slammed shut. From the cover of trees, Mason watched Preston approach the shed, keys in hand. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sheriff Thompson, his voice low but firm. "Bob, it's Mason Hayes. I need you at Preston Whitmore's place right now. He's got a dog locked in a shed out back. Been there a long time from the looks of it. It's bad, Bob, real bad." Sheriff Robert Thompson arrived 20 minutes later, by which time Mason had positioned himself near Preston's driveway, trying to appear as though he'd just arrived. The sheriff's weathered face revealed nothing as he stepped from his cruiser, adjusting his belt with the practiced motion of a man who'd worn a uniform for 3 decades. "Mason," he nodded, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and familiarity common to small-town law enforcement. "Got your call. Preston says you've been trespassing on his property." Mason's jaw tightened. "Did he mention the dog he's got locked up and starving back there? He says he's got a sick hunting dog he's treating himself. Says it's got a skin condition." Sheriff Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Now, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper." "Mason, but the Whitmores have been in this town longer than the courthouse." "Then you'll have no problem checking that shed," Mason replied, crossing his arms. "That animal needs a vet, not whatever Preston's been doing or not doing." Preston emerged from his house, his lanky frame moving with deliberate slowness. Unlike his father's perpetual business attire, Preston favored worn jeans and flannel shirts, giving him the appearance of a working man despite having never held a consistent job that anyone could recall. "Sheriff, I'd like this man removed from my property," Preston called, his voice unnervingly calm. "He broke into my shed and trespassed. I have every right to press charges." "All in good time. Preston," the sheriff replied. "Mind if I take a look at this dog Mason's concerned about?" A flicker of something annoyance. Perhaps fear crossed Preston's face before disappearing behind a placid smile. "Of course, though it's unnecessary. The animal has a hereditary condition. I've been consulting with a specialist." The 3 men walked to the shed in silence. Preston unlocked the padlock with exaggerated patience, swinging the door open with a gesture that suggested Mason had overreacted. The smell that wafted out caused the sheriff to step back involuntarily. "Jesus Christ," Sheriff Thompson muttered, moving past Preston into the dim interior. Mason followed, his eyes adjusting to see the German shepherd still huddled in the corner. The dog's gaze found Mason immediately, a barely perceptible shift in its posture suggesting recognition. "This animal needs immediate medical attention," the sheriff said, his professional tone doing little to mask his disgust. "This goes beyond a skin condition." Preston shrugged. "Dogs get sick. I was handling it by leaving it chained in filth with no food or water." Mason's voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "Look at its condition. This didn't happen overnight." The sheriff crouched near the dog, which shrank back further into its corner. "How long have you had this animal?" "Preston." "Few months. Got him from a breeder who was closing shop." The lie came easily, spreading across Preston's face like oil on water. Mason stepped closer to the dog, noticing how its ribs heaved with each breath. "Sheriff, this dog needs a vet now. We can sort out the rest later." For a tense moment, Sheriff Thompson looked between Preston and Mason, the weight of town politics visibly pressing on his shoulders. Finally, he nodded. "I'll authorize emergency medical care. We'll discuss potential charges after we get a vet's assessment." The relief Mason felt was short-lived. Preston's response was a shrug and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Do what you need to, Sheriff. It's just a dog with medical issues. Nothing criminal about that." It took nearly 30 minutes to free the German Shepherd, as the animal was too weak to walk out on its own. Mason carefully wrapped it in a clean blanket from his truck, trying to avoid the worst of its wounds while providing warmth to the trembling body. Throughout the process, the dog made no sound, watching the humans with wary but curiously intelligent eyes. "Doctor?" Sarah Mitchell was closing her veterinary clinic when Mason arrived with Sheriff Thompson following in his cruiser. In her mid-30s, with prematurely silver-streaked dark hair, Sarah had a reputation for both skill and compassion that extended beyond Willow Creek's boundaries. "My God," she breathed, as Mason carefully carried the blanket-wrapped dog inside. "What happened to this animal?" "Preston Whitmore happened," Mason replied, his voice tight. "Can you help him?" Sarah's examination was thorough and gentle. The German Shepherd remained unnaturally still throughout, flinching only when she touched particularly painful areas. As she worked, she dictated notes into a recorder, cataloging each wound, each sign of neglect and abuse. Severe malnutrition, multiple infected pressure sores, dermatitis with secondary infections, muscle atrophy consistent with long-term confinement. She looked up at Sheriff Thompson. "This dog has been neglected for months, not days. And these marks here," she pointed to circular burns on the dog's hindquarters, "these are deliberate." "Will he make it?" Mason asked quietly. Sarah's professional demeanor softened. "He's severely compromised, but dogs can be remarkably resilient. The next 48 hours will tell us more." Sheriff Thompson cleared his throat. "I'll need a full report for possible charges." "You'll have it by morning," Sarah promised, her tone making it clear the document would spare no details. As they stepped outside the examination room, the sheriff placed a heavy hand on Mason's shoulder. "This doesn't look good for Preston, I'll admit that, but his father doesn't run this town," Mason interrupted, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "No," Sheriff Thompson agreed with a sigh. "But he runs enough of it to make this complicated. I'm just saying, be prepared for this to get messy." Mason watched through the window as Sarah gently cleaned a particularly bad wound on the dog's back. "It already is, Sheriff. It already is." 2 days later, Mason sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair at the veterinary clinic, watching the German Shepherd sleep. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had inserted an IV to provide fluids and antibiotics, shaved large patches of fur to treat the skin infections, and bandaged the worst of the wounds. The dog looked smaller without his matted coat, more vulnerable, but the labored breathing had eased somewhat. "He's a fighter," Sarah said, entering the room with a clipboard. She'd been working nearly around the clock, taking breaks only when her assistant could monitor the dog's condition. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her movements remained precise and purposeful. "His blood work shows anemia and liver issues from malnutrition, but nothing that can't improve with proper care." Mason nodded, his gaze fixed on the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest. "Has he told you his name yet?" A small smile touched Sarah's lips. "No, but I've been calling him Ranger. He has the look of a working dog German Shepherd, probably purebred from his bone structure. Despite everything, There's something dignified about him. Ranger, Mason repeated softly. The name seemed to fit. Any idea how old he is? Based on his teeth, probably around 2 years. Still young. She hesitated, setting the clipboard down. Mason. There's something else. When I was cleaning him up, I found this buried in the fur around his neck. She handed him a small object, a worn leather collar that had clearly been cut off. The tag was unusual, not the standard identification most pet owners used. Stamped into the metal were the words Subject 7 and a series of numbers. Subject 7. Mason turned the tag over, finding nothing but smooth metal on the back. What the hell does that mean? Sarah shook her head. I don't know, but I also found this. She gently lifted one of Ranger's ears, pointing to a small mark that might have been easily overlooked, a tattoo, no larger than a dime, showing what appeared to be a number 7 inside a small diamond shape. It's not a standard breeder or kennel mark. This was done deliberately, and not by someone concerned with the dog's comfort. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the clinic's air conditioning. You think Preston was experimenting on him somehow? I think, Sarah chose her words carefully, that this dog has experienced systematic mistreatment beyond simple neglect. And I think Preston Whitmore has some serious explaining to do. But Preston, it seemed, had no intention of explaining anything. Sheriff Thompson called that afternoon to inform Mason that Preston had paid a $500 fine for animal neglect, a misdemeanor, and been released with a warning. A warning? Mason's voice drew the attention of other waiting room clients. He stepped outside, pacing in front of the clinic. Bob, you saw that dog. You smelled that shed. That's not neglect. That's torture. I know how it looks, the sheriff replied, sounding tired. But without prior complaints or additional evidence of intentional cruelty, the prosecutor says this is the most we can do right now. Preston claims he rescued the dog recently and was quarantining it because of infectious skin conditions. And you believe that... A heavy sigh came through the phone. What I believe and what I can prove are different things. Mason, you know that. After hanging up, Mason stood motionless in the parking lot, the Montana autumn chill seeping through his jacket. The mountains in the distance were already capped with early snow, their massive presence usually providing comfort. Today, they just looked indifferent to the suffering below. When he returned inside, Sarah was waiting. Sheriff Thompson called me too, she said. This isn't right. Mason? No, it's not. He looked through the window at Ranger, who had awakened and was staring at the door as if sensing their presence. What happens to him now? Legally, he should go to the shelter until he's healthy enough for adoption, but... Sarah hesitated, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The shelter doesn't have facilities for a case this severe. He needs constant monitoring, specialized care. Mason understood what she wasn't saying. I'll take him. It won't be easy. He's traumatized, probably never been properly socialized. The recovery will be long, and there may be behavioral issues. I've got time. Mason interrupted. And I know something about trauma. The next morning, Mason discovered just how quickly small-town news traveled. Stopping at Miller's General Store for supplies, he found himself the center of unwanted attention. Conversations paused as he walked down aisles, resuming in hushed tones once he passed. Heard you're stirring up trouble with the Whitmores. Frank Miller said as he rang up Mason's purchases. Unlike the whispers, Frank's approach was direct, his weathered face betraying neither approval nor condemnation. "That's a dangerous game in this town. Not playing games. Frank, just helping a dog that needed it." Frank nodded, bagging the dog food and medications. "Preston always was an odd duck, even as a kid. Remember when the Andersons' cat went missing? Never did find that animal." He leaned forward slightly. "But James Whitmore donated the land for our new community center last year. Folks have long memories for kindness around here, and short ones for cruelty." Mason took his bags, meeting Frank's gaze steadily. The older man shrugged. "Just saying, there's more than one side to every story." By midday, Mason had converted part of his living room into a recovery space for Ranger. Old blankets formed a soft bed near the wood stove. Water and food bowls sat nearby, along with the medications Sarah had prescribed. The cabin, normally sparse and utilitarian, now looked like a makeshift veterinary ward. Diane Foster arrived as he was arranging the last of the supplies, carrying a pot of what smelled like her famous beef stew. "Figured you'd be busy with your new patient," she said, setting the pot on his kitchen counter. "This will keep you fed for a few days at least." Mason smiled, genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness. "Thanks. Diane, I appreciate it." She waved away his gratitude, moving to inspect his preparations for Ranger. "You heard Preston's back home like nothing happened. His father was at the diner this morning, talking about youthful mistakes and blown out of proportion. Made me lose my appetite. The sheriff says there's not enough evidence for serious charges." Diane's expression hardened. "Evidence I've been watching that property for years. Preston brings dogs in, but they never come out. I told Sheriff Thompson about the whining I've heard before, not just this time. He said without seeing anything, there wasn't much he could do." Mason paused in arranging Ranger's medications. "How many dogs are we talking about, Diane?" "At least 4 that I know of over the past 2 years. Different breeds, different sizes. He'd bring them in at night, usually. Sometimes I'd hear them for weeks. Sometimes just days." She shuddered. "Then nothing." The implication hung heavily in the air. Mason was about to respond when his phone rang Sarah, letting him know Ranger was ready to be discharged into his care. Bringing Ranger home proved more challenging than Mason had anticipated. The dog was terrified of the car, huddling in the farthest corner of the crate Sarah had provided. At the cabin, he refused to exit voluntarily, forcing Mason to carefully lift the entire crate and place it near the prepared bed, leaving the door open for Ranger to emerge when ready. Hours passed with Ranger remaining motionless in the crate, eyes tracking Mason's every movement around the cabin. Only when Mason sat quietly reading, deliberately ignoring his new charge, did Ranger finally venture out, moving with painful slowness to the water bowl. His ears remained flat against his head, body hunched as if expecting punishment for this small act of self-preservation. "It's okay, buddy," Mason said softly, not moving from his chair. "Everything here is yours for the taking." And that night, Mason slept on the couch rather than in his bedroom, wanting to stay close if Ranger needed anything. He woke several times to find the dog watching him from the crate, neither trusting enough to sleep nor strong enough to maintain vigilance for long. By morning, exhaustion had claimed them both. Mason woke to find Ranger had finally collapsed into sleep, his body half in, half out of the crate as if he'd tried to keep watch but failed. The sight brought an unexpected lump to Mason's throat. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Medications administered twice daily, first with struggling and fear, later with reluctant acceptance. Meals offered at regular intervals, each one finished with increasing enthusiasm as Ranger's appetite returned. Bandages changed, wounds cleaned, fur gradually growing back over healing skin. The physical recovery was measurable, tracked in Sarah's notes during their weekly checkups. The emotional recovery proved harder to chart. Ranger's first night terror came during a thunderstorm, the dog waking with a howl that bordered on human in its anguish. Mason found him pressed against the wall, trembling so violently his claws scraped against the wooden floor. Nothing would calm him. Not soft words, not treats, not even the sedative Sarah had provided for emergencies. In desperation, Mason simply sat on the floor nearby, speaking in a low, continuous stream about nothing in particular: his time in the military, his childhood in Willow Creek, Emily's love of gardening. Eventually, Ranger's trembling subsided, though he remained alert, those intelligent eyes fixed on Mason as if trying to decode the human's intentions. Similar episodes followed, triggered by seemingly random stimuli: the sound of a car backfiring, a delivery person knocking, even the clink of metal tools when Mason was repairing his porch. Each time, the recovery period grew shorter. The distance Ranger maintained decreased. The first time Ranger approached Mason voluntarily, without food as incentive, came almost a month after his rescue. Mason had been dozing on the couch, an old war movie playing quietly on the television. He woke to a gentle pressure against his dangling hand Ranger's nose, briefly touching his fingers before the dog withdrew to a safer distance. A small gesture, over in seconds, but Mason recognized it for the monumental step it represented. "Good boy," he whispered, remaining perfectly still so as not to shatter the fragile moment of trust. That evening, Mason found himself thinking about Emily for the first time in months without the usual crushing weight of grief. She would have loved Ranger, would have had the patience for his healing journey. In their early days together, before his deployment started, they'd talked about getting a dog, maybe starting a family. Life had taken them in different directions. As autumn deepened toward winter, Mason's research into Preston Whitmore intensified. The collar tag and ear tattoo nagged at him, suggesting organization and purpose beyond simple animal cruelty. Diane's accounts of other dogs strengthened his suspicion that whatever Preston had been doing, Ranger wasn't the first victim. Using the public computers at Willow Creek Library to avoid any trace on his personal devices, Mason searched for information on animal experimentation, behavioral conditioning, and anything connected to the Whitmore family. Much of what he found was mundane James Whitmore's construction company history, charity events, political connections. Preston appeared in fewer articles, usually as a footnote to his father's achievements. A breakthrough came when Mason expanded his search beyond Willow Creek. Preston had attended veterinary school at Colorado State University, but never completed his degree. Later, he'd worked briefly for a pharmaceutical research company called Neurobehavioral Systems, leaving abruptly after less than a year. The company specialized in neurological medications, particularly treatments for anxiety and PTSD. Mason printed the articles, careful to clear the browser history afterward. Something about the connection to PTSD treatment resonated uncomfortably. Many of his former military colleagues struggled with the condition, himself included. The idea that Preston might be conducting unauthorized experiments related to trauma treatment added a disturbing new dimension to the case. Sarah confirmed his suspicions during Ranger's next checkup. "His blood work shows traces of several compounds," she explained, showing Mason the laboratory results. "Some are standard medications, but others I had to research. They're experimental anxiolytics drugs being developed for anxiety disorders, including PTSD. They're not approved for use in humans yet, let alone animals." "Could that explain his behavior? The extreme fear responses?" Sarah's expression was grim. "It could explain everything from his physical condition to his psychological state. If Preston was using him to test these drugs without proper protocols, the dosing alone could cause serious harm. Add in the isolation, possible physical abuse." She trailed off, gently stroking Ranger's head as the dog submitted to her examination with far less fear than in previous visits. That night, after Ranger had settled into his bed, now moved closer to Mason's couch, Mason made a decision. Sheriff Thompson might be constrained by politics and legal requirements, but Mason wasn't. Tomorrow, he would return to Preston's property. If there were records of what had been done to Ranger or evidence of other animals, he would find them. He looked over at Ranger, who had raised his head as if sensing Mason's resolve. The dog's condition had improved remarkably. The protruding ribs were less visible, new fur covered most of the healing wounds, and his eyes had lost the dull resignation of their first meeting. But Mason knew that physical recovery was only part of the journey. The deeper wounds, the ones that caused Ranger to freeze at sudden movements or cower at loud noises, would take much longer to heal. If they ever did. "We're going to make this right," Mason promised softly. Ranger watched him steadily, his tail offering a single, tentative wag the first Mason had seen. It felt like both a blessing and a warning. Mason chose a moonless night for his return to Preston's property, parking his truck half a mile away and approaching on foot through the dense woods that bordered the eastern edge of the land. The late October air bit at his exposed skin, carrying the scent of pine and impending snow. He wore dark clothing, a backpack containing a flashlight, gloves, and his phone. The weight of the small digital camera in his pocket reminded him of surveillance operations from his military days, though this mission felt far more personal. Ranger had seemed to sense his intentions that evening, watching with unusual intensity as Mason prepared to leave. The dog had even followed him to the door, standing closer than he normally dared, a low whine escaping when Mason gently pushed him back inside. "I'll be back soon," Mason had promised, wondering if animals could understand the concept of justice, or if they simply lived in the eternal present of their experiences. Preston's house stood dark and silent, no vehicles in the driveway. Mason had confirmed through casual conversation at the diner that Preston was attending a business dinner with his father in Bozeman, 2 hours away. The likelihood of interruption was minimal, but Mason moved cautiously nonetheless, years of training guiding his approach. The shed where Ranger had been kept was padlocked again, but Mason had come prepared. The lock yielded quickly to his tools, a skill learned during military training that he'd never expected to use in civilian life. Inside, the small building had been cleaned, the chain and filthy bedding removed, the concrete floor scrubbed with bleach whose sharp smell still lingered. Preston had eliminated the obvious evidence of neglect, but Mason wasn't interested in the shed anymore. His attention focused on the main house. Breaking into a home crossed a line that picking a shed lock didn't. But the memory of Ranger's suffering pushed ethical concerns to the background. The back door's lock proved more challenging, but eventually surrendered to his persistent efforts. Mason slipped inside, standing motionless in the kitchen until his eyes adjusted to the deeper darkness. Preston's house was meticulously organized, almost obsessively clean. The kitchen contained high-end appliances that looked barely used. The living room featured expensive furniture arranged at precise angles, books aligned perfectly on shelves, not a magazine or remote control out of place. It felt more like a display than a home, a stark contrast to Mason's lived-in cabin with its comfortable disorder. Mason moved methodically through the ground floor, searching for anything connected to Ranger or other animals. He found nothing until he reached a small study off the main hallway. Here, Preston's precision served Mason's purpose. A filing cabinet contained folders arranged alphabetically, including one labeled Project Recalibration. Inside were handwritten notes detailing observations of Subject 7 and 6 others before him. The clinical language couldn't disguise the cruelty. Subject exhibits decreased stress response after 72 hours of sensory isolation. Medication protocol increased to determine maximum tolerance. Pain stimulus applied to establish baseline reaction. Mason photographed each page, his hands steady, despite the rage building inside him. Ranger. Subject 7 had been part of an unauthorized experiment using isolation, fear conditioning, and experimental drugs to study trauma responses. The note suggested Preston was attempting to develop techniques to reset fear pathways in the brain, with the eventual goal of treating human anxiety disorders. The earlier subjects were listed as terminated due to insufficient progress or excessive physical deterioration. A noise from outside a car passing on the distant road reminded Mason of his vulnerability. He quickly photographed the remaining documents, including what appeared to be correspondence with a private research foundation that had provided funding. Names of prominent individuals appeared in the letters, including some Mason recognized from national news. Whatever Preston was doing, he had financial backing from people with resources and influence. As Mason prepared to leave, a final folder caught his attention, one labeled simply Hayes. His blood ran cold as he opened it to find newspaper clippings about his military service. Notes on his PTSD symptoms gleaned from medical records that should have been confidential, and observations of his routine in Willow Creek. The most recent entry was dated just after Ranger's rescue. Subject shows expected attachment to S7. Monitoring continues. Mason was still processing this discovery when headlights swept across the front windows. A vehicle was turning into the driveway, Preston returning hours earlier than expected. Mason quickly replaced the folders, closed the cabinet, and moved toward the back door through which he'd entered. He was halfway there when he heard keys in the front lock. With no time to exit, Mason slipped into a small coat closet off the hallway, leaving the door open a crack to monitor the situation. Preston entered alone, switching on lights and moving with the precise, controlled manner Mason had observed before. He proceeded directly to the study, as if drawn there by some sixth sense. Mason heard the filing cabinet opening. A long silence. Then the sound of papers being shuffled. When Preston spoke, his voice carried clearly through the quiet house. "I know you're here. Hayes? My security system sends alerts to my phone." Mason's military training took over. Remaining hidden would only worsen his position if discovered. Better to control the confrontation. He stepped from the closet, moving silently into the study doorway. "Preston." The younger Whitmore didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. He merely turned from the open filing cabinet a cold smile touching his lips, but not his eyes. Breaking and entering, that's a serious crime, even for a local hero. Not as serious as what you've been doing to those dogs. Mason nodded toward the files. I've seen enough to know what happened to Ranger, to Subject 7, and the others before him. Ranger? Preston's smile widened slightly. You named him How Sentimental. He's a research subject. Mason, not a pet. His suffering has purpose, unlike the random trauma you and your military friends experienced. The casual cruelty in his tone made Mason's hands curl into fists, but he kept his voice steady. What you're doing is illegal. Animal cruelty, practicing veterinary medicine without a license, unauthorized drug testing. Please? Preston waved a dismissive hand. My father has judges and prosecutors on speed dial. Do you really think any of those charges would stick? Besides, the research is important. Do you know how many veterans kill themselves every day because conventional PTSD treatments fail them? The cynical invocation of struggling veterans fueled Mason's anger. Don't pretend this is about helping anyone. This is about you playing God in your backyard shed, torturing animals because you can. Something shifted in Preston's expression, a crack in the facade of control. You don't understand. None of you do. I'm developing protocols that could revolutionize trauma treatment. Yes, some subjects don't survive the process, but the successful ones, the ones that can be recalibrated, prove the concept works. Recalibrated. Mason took a step forward, noting how Preston instinctively backed up against the filing cabinet. Is that what you call breaking an animal's spirit? Creating such extreme fear and isolation that they'll accept any kindness, no matter how small, as salvation? Preston's eyes narrowed. That's exactly the point. The brain can be reset under the right conditions. Existing trauma pathways overwritten with new associations. Subject 7 was my most promising case before you interfered. His response to controlled fear stimuli was showing measurable changes. His name is Ranger, Mason said quietly. Dangerously. And he's not your experiment anymore. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence. Then Preston reached slowly into his desk drawer. I think it's time for you to leave. Hayes. The pistol that emerged didn't surprise Mason. He'd anticipated escalation, had seen the capacity for violence behind Preston's clinical detachment. What he hadn't expected was the sound of a car door slamming outside, followed by a familiar voice calling Preston's name. Sheriff Thompson. Mason recognized the heavy footsteps approaching the front door. Preston's smile returned, more genuine in its malice now. Perfect timing. I've caught an intruder in my home. Sheriff armed and dangerous. Mason assessed his options rapidly. If Preston claimed self-defense with the sheriff as a witness, the situation could turn deadly. He needed to change the dynamic before Thompson entered. Your research files won't stay hidden. Preston, I've already documented everything. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Preston's face as the sheriff knocked on the door. Preston, it's Bob Thompson. Everything okay in there? Your security company called? One moment, Sheriff. Preston called, his voice perfectly controlled despite the gun in his hand. He lowered his voice to address Mason. You've seen my files. You know who supports this research. People far more important than a washed-up soldier with PTSD. This ends tonight, one way or another. The threat hung in the air as Preston backed toward the hallway. Gun still trained on Mason. "Come in. Sheriff back here. I've got an intruder." What happened next occurred with the surreal clarity that Mason associated with combat. Sheriff Thompson entered, assessed the scene in an instant, Preston with gun drawn, Mason with empty hands raised, and made a critical decision. "Preston, lower your weapon. Now." Preston's composure finally cracked. "He broke into my house. He's been stalking me, obsessed with that worthless dog." "I said lower your weapon." Thompson's own gun was now drawn, his expression grim. "Mason, hands where I can see them at all times. What's going on here?" Before Mason could answer, another vehicle pulled up outside, its headlights sweeping across the windows. Car doors slammed, followed by urgent knocking. Preston's face drained of color as Thompson moved to the front door, keeping his gun trained in their direction. "Dr." Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch, accompanied by a man in a suit who introduced himself as Agent Carlson from the State Attorney General's office. "Sheriff Thompson," Sarah said breathlessly, "we have evidence of ongoing animal abuse and unauthorized experimentation by Preston Whitmore. The blood samples from the German Shepherd." Agent Carlson interrupted smoothly. "We have a warrant to search these premises. Sheriff, the veterinarian's evidence was compelling enough to convince a judge in Helena, even at this hour." Preston's gun clattered to the floor as his arm went limp. "My father is currently being questioned about financial irregularities related to research funding," Agent Carlson finished. "It seems several prominent donors were unaware of exactly how their money was being used. They're quite eager to distance themselves from the situation." Sheriff Thompson holstered his weapon with a heavy sigh. "I'll need statements from everyone. Mason, you want to explain why you're here before official law enforcement?" Mason met the sheriff's eyes squarely. "I was gathering evidence. I didn't trust the local investigation to be thorough, given the Whitmore influence." "That's still breaking and entering," Thompson pointed out, though without much conviction. "I'd be more concerned about what he found than how he found it," Sarah interjected, moving to Mason's side. "The blood work on Ranger on all the dogs we've tested this week shows evidence of experimental drugs combined with systematic stress induction. It's torture disguised as research." As Agent Carlson began reading Preston his rights, Mason noticed something odd about Thompson's reaction. The sheriff didn't seem surprised by the allegations, only resigned, as if confirming something he'd long suspected but avoided confronting. "You knew," Mason said quietly while Preston was being handcuffed. "You suspected something wasn't right here." Thompson's weathered face revealed a complex mixture of shame and relief. "Had my doubts for years. Never enough evidence to act on. And the Whitmore name—" he shook his head. "Sometimes it's easier to look the other way until you can't anymore. I'm not proud of it." As they walked outside, Mason was struck by how ordinary the night appeared, stars visible through breaks in the clouds. Distant mountains, a darker shadow against the dark sky. Nature indifferent to the human drama unfolding. He thought of Ranger waiting at home, steadily healing from wounds both visible and invisible, and felt a profound gratitude that at least one victim of Preston's research had escaped. Agent Carlson approached as Preston was placed in a state police vehicle. "We'll need your testimony, Mr. Hayes. This case could get complicated, especially with James Whitmore's connections." "Whatever you need," Mason replied, watching as evidence teams began unloading equipment. "Just make sure this stops for good." Sarah touched his arm gently. "How did you know to come tonight specifically?" Mason thought about the folder with his name, the meticulous notes on his movements. "Just a hunch," he said finally. "Sometimes the past makes you hyper-aware of threats in the present." As the legal machinery began its slow process of documentation and procedure, Mason felt a strange disconnection from the scene. His thoughts were already back at the cabin with Ranger, wondering if tonight's small victory would help heal the invisible wounds that still caused the dog to tremble at sudden sounds or cower when cornered. Justice was necessary, but Mason knew from experience that it was rarely sufficient for true healing. That would require something more elusive: time, patience, and the gradual rebuilding of trust in a world that had shown only cruelty. It was a journey he and Ranger would continue together, each in their own way serving as both guide and companion to the other. 3 days after Preston's arrest, Ranger's condition took a devastating turn. Mason woke to find the dog lying motionless beside his bed, breathing shallow and rapid, eyes glazed with pain. The progress of recent weeks seemed to have vanished overnight, leaving Ranger's body once again frail and trembling. "Hold on, buddy," Mason whispered, wrapping Ranger gently in a blanket. The dog made no effort to resist being lifted, his usual wariness subsumed by whatever was ravaging his system. The limp weight in Mason's arm sent a spike of fear through him as he carried Ranger to his truck. The drive to Sarah's clinic seemed endless, though it took less than 15 minutes. Mason kept one hand on Ranger's side, monitoring each labored breath, the frantic, whispered promises spilling from his lips, more prayer than reassurance. "Stay with me. We're almost there. You've come too far to give up now." Sarah was already waiting when he arrived, alerted by his panicked call. The practiced efficiency of her movements did little to mask the concern in her eyes as she quickly examined Ranger. "His temperature is dangerously high," she reported, immediately instructing her assistant to start an IV. "He's showing signs of systemic infection, possibly sepsis. Mason, did he eat anything unusual? Access any medications?" Mason shook his head, watching helplessly as Sarah worked. "Nothing. He was fine last night, tired after our walk, but eating normally, taking his regular meds. I woke up and found him like this." Sarah drew blood samples with swift precision. "I need to run these immediately. His white cell count, liver enzymes." She paused, meeting Mason's eyes directly. This could be related to whatever Preston was doing. "Some of those experimental compounds might have long-term effects we don't understand. The possibility that Ranger's suffering might continue indefinitely, that Preston's cruelty could extend beyond his arrest," hit Mason with physical force. He sank into a chair as Sarah disappeared into the lab with the blood samples, his mind racing through recent events, searching for anything that might explain Ranger's sudden decline. An hour later, Sarah returned with results that confirmed her worst suspicions. "His system is reacting to something, possibly withdrawal from one of the compounds Preston was administering. His organs are under significant stress." "Can you treat it?" Mason's voice sounded strange to his own ears, tight with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge: the fear of losing this animal who had somehow become central to his existence. Sarah's hesitation told him everything before she spoke. "I can treat the symptoms, try to support his system while it fights, but—" She placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "We need to know exactly what Preston was giving him, the specific formulations, dosages, schedule. Without that information—" I'm working blind. The implication was clear. Preston Whitmore, currently being held without bail pending multiple charges, was the only person who knew precisely what had been done to Ranger. Mason stood abruptly, decision made before conscious thought could intervene. Keep him stable. I'm going to get answers. Sheriff Thompson was unsympathetic to Mason's request for access to Preston. The state police have jurisdiction now. He's being held in Helena, pending arraignment. Even if I wanted to help, I couldn't get you in to see him. Bob, this is about saving Ranger's life, not the case against Preston. Mason leaned across the sheriff's desk, desperation making him less careful with his words than usual. Sarah says he's dying from whatever Preston did to him. We need information about those drugs. Thompson sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. Mason, I understand, but do you? Mason interrupted, his voice rising. That dog survived months of torture, and now that he's finally safe, he's dying because of withdrawal from drugs he never should have been given. If it was your dog, what would you do? The sheriff's expression softened slightly. I'd move heaven and earth, he admitted, but that doesn't change the legal reality. Preston's lawyer has him locked down tight, no visitors except counsel. Mason straightened, a new thought forming. What about his files, the ones from the house? They should detail exactly what he was doing. Evidence in an active investigation. Agent Carlson took everything back to Helena. Then I need to talk to Carlson. Mason was already moving toward the door. Thompson called after him. Mason, don't do anything stupid. Ranger needs you free, not sitting in a cell yourself. The warning registered dimly as Mason drove back to the clinic to check on Ranger before heading to Helena. Sarah had stabilized the dog's condition temporarily, but the underlying crisis remained. Ranger's eyes tracked Mason weakly as he entered the treatment room, a ghost of recognition visible despite the pain and sedation. I'm going to fix this, Mason promised, gently stroking the less bandaged areas of Ranger's head. Just hold on a little longer. The drive to Helena took nearly 3 hours, the vast Montana landscape flowing past unnoticed as Mason mentally rehearsed what he would say to Agent Carlson, to Preston, if necessary, to anyone who stood between him and the information Ranger needed. The rational part of his mind recognized the disproportionate emotional response, this level of desperation for an animal he'd known only weeks, but rationality held little sway against the raw need to prevent one more innocent death. Agent Carlson proved surprisingly receptive to Mason's plight, though his hands were legally tied regarding direct access to either Preston or the original evidence files. The evidence is being processed by our forensic team, he explained, leading Mason through the government building. I can't release it or even show it to you without compromising the case. Mason felt defeat settling heavy on his shoulders until Carlson continued. However, Dr. Mitchell's concerns about the dog's health constitute a legitimate animal welfare issue. I've asked our forensic veterinarian to review the portions of Whitmore's notes pertaining to chemical compounds and treatment protocols. He led Mason to a small conference room where a middle-aged woman with steel-rimmed glasses was examining documents. Dr. Patel has been analyzing the pharmaceutical aspects of the case. She may be able to help. Dr. Patel listened intently as Mason described Ranger's symptoms, nodding occasionally and taking notes. Based on Whitmore's records, Subject 7 Ranger was receiving a complex protocol of experimental anxiolytics combined with cortisol modulators. The withdrawal syndrome would be severe, particularly given the abrupt discontinuation. "Can you tell Dr. Mitchell how to treat it?" Mason asked, hope rising cautiously. Dr. Patel frowned. "It's not that simple. These compounds were experimental, some possibly synthesized by Whitmore himself. However," she pulled a file toward her, "I can provide a general detoxification protocol that might help, along with supportive treatments for the specific symptoms you've described." It wasn't everything they needed, but it was more than Mason had dared hope for. As Dr. Patel compiled her recommendations, Agent Carlson pulled Mason aside. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "We found records of all 7 subjects in Whitmore's files. The previous 6 were euthanized when they either failed to respond to the protocol or developed severe side effects." Mason felt cold despite the overheated office. "Like what Ranger's experiencing now?" Carlson nodded grimly. "Almost identical symptoms in at least 2 cases." Whitmore documented their decline in detail. He seemed to view it as valuable data rather than suffering. The drive back to Willow Creek passed in a blur of alternating hope and dread. Mason called Sarah from the road, relaying Dr. Patel's recommendations, which she began implementing immediately. By the time he reached the clinic, evening had fallen, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Sarah moved between monitoring equipment and Ranger's still form with calm efficiency, though the strain showed in the tightness around her eyes. "We've started the protocol," she told Mason, leading him to Ranger's side. "The next 24 hours will be critical. If his system can process these compounds without further organ damage, he has a chance." Ranger looked impossibly small and fragile on the examination table, his body connected to IV lines and monitoring equipment. His breathing remained shallow but had steadied somewhat. When Mason gently touched his paw, Ranger's eyes opened briefly. A flicker of recognition visible before exhaustion claimed him again. "I'll stay with him," Mason said. It wasn't a request. Sarah nodded, understanding. "I'll be monitoring him all night. There's a chair you can use." The hours crawled by, marked by the steady beep of monitoring equipment and Sarah's periodic examinations. Around midnight, Ranger's fever spiked dramatically, his body trembling with seizure-like intensity. Sarah worked frantically to stabilize him, administering medications that seemed to have little effect. "His system is overwhelmed," she explained, her professional composure beginning to crack. "Whatever Preston did created dependencies we can't fully address. His body is essentially fighting itself." Mason watched helplessly as Ranger struggled, each labored breath seeming more difficult than the last. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him after surviving months of deliberate cruelty. Ranger might be killed by the absence of the very chemicals that had been instruments of his torture. As dawn approached, Ranger's condition deteriorated further. His breathing became more erratic, organs beginning to fail under the strain. Sarah, exhausted but unwavering, continued adjusting treatments, trying everything medical science offered. "Talk to him," she suggested softly during a moment of relative stability. "He knows your voice. Sometimes that connection can be powerful." Mason moved closer, gently placing his hand where Ranger could feel it. "Hey, buddy," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "You fought so hard. I know you're tired." He paused, struggling to continue. "But I need you to keep fighting a little longer. We have so much living left to do, you and I." As he spoke, memories of Emily surfaced unexpectedly, her laugh, her determination, the way she'd faced her own battles with quiet courage. She would have loved this broken, resilient animal, would have seen, as Mason did, the dignity beneath the damage. "We're both survivors," Mason continued, no longer caring that Sarah could hear the tears in his voice. "Both damaged in ways that might never fully heal. But we found each other, and that has to mean something." Ranger's eyes opened slightly at the sound of Mason's voice, his gaze finding Mason's face with what seemed like impossible effort. In that moment, Mason felt a connection that transcended words, a recognition between two beings who had endured darkness and emerged altered but undefeated. As the sun began to rise, painting the clinic room with pale golden light, Ranger's vital signs began to weaken further. The monitors told a story of a body reaching its limits, of systems beginning to shut down despite every medical intervention. Mason kept his hand on Ranger's side, feeling each breath become more labored. The unfairness of it all, that this dog who had endured so much might die just as he'd found safety, felt like a physical weight crushing Mason's chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words inadequate against the tide of impending loss. "I wish I'd found you sooner." The call that changed everything came at 5:47 a.m., jarring Mason from the half-sleep of exhaustion. He fumbled for his phone, registering Sarah's name on the screen. "Mason." Her voice was tight with controlled urgency. "I need you back at the clinic. Ranger's condition has shifted." Shifted how? Mason was already on his feet, searching for his boots in the dim light of dawn. "Just get here." The connection ended before he could ask more questions. The drive to the clinic passed in a blur of worst-case scenarios. Mason had left Ranger only because Sarah had insisted he get some rest, promising to call immediately if anything changed. That had been 4 hours ago. 4 hours in which the dog's fragile hold on life could have slipped entirely. The clinic's lights blazed against the pre-dawn darkness. Mason rushed inside, bracing himself for devastating news, only to find Sarah standing in the treatment area with an expression he couldn't immediately interpret. "What happened?" he demanded, moving toward Ranger's still form on the examination table. Sarah held up a hand. "His fever broke about an hour ago. I don't fully understand it. But something's changed. His vitals are stabilizing." Mason approached slowly, afraid to hope. Ranger's eyes were closed, but his breathing seemed deeper, more regular than the shallow gasps of the previous day. One of the monitoring machines showed a steadier pattern than before. "What did you do?" Mason asked, gently placing his hand on Ranger's side, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. Sarah shook her head, the exhaustion of a sleepless night evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Nothing new. We continued the protocol from Dr. Patel, but honestly, I was preparing for the worst." Then suddenly his fever broke, and his numbers started improving. She gestured toward the monitors. "It's like his body finally figured out how to process the toxins." As if responding to their voices, Ranger's eyes opened slightly. There was a clarity in his gaze that had been absent during yesterday's crisis, a recognition that sparked something profound in Mason's chest. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Ranger's tail moved weakly against the table, a small gesture that felt monumental. Sarah checked the monitors again, professional caution tempering her growing optimism. "He's not out of danger yet. Organ function is still compromised, and we need to watch for secondary infections given his weakened state." "But he's fighting," Mason said. Not a question, but an affirmation. "Yes." Sarah's tired face softened into a genuine smile. "He's definitely fighting." The next 48 hours became a vigil of cautious hope. Mason refused to leave the clinic except for brief trips home to shower and change clothes. He slept in the uncomfortable chair beside Ranger's kennel, now moved from the treatment room to a quieter recovery area. Sarah arranged her schedule to monitor Ranger personally, bringing in a colleague to cover her other patients. Slowly, hour by hour, Ranger's vital signs strengthened. By the second day, he was able to take small amounts of water, then soft food offered from Mason's hand. Each small victory a stronger tail wag. Sitting up briefly, showing interest in his surroundings, felt profound against the backdrop of how close they had come to losing him. On the morning of the third day, Sheriff Thompson visited the clinic. He stood awkwardly in the doorway of the recovery room, hat in hands, watching as Mason coaxed Ranger to take another spoonful of the special recovery food Sarah had prepared. "Heard he was doing better," the sheriff said by way of greeting. "Tough animal." Mason nodded, not taking his eyes off Ranger. "Tougher than anyone knew." Thompson shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Got some news that might interest you. Agent Carlson called this morning. They've been digging deeper into Preston's research, interviewing former colleagues from that pharmaceutical company." Now Mason looked up, immediately alert. "And turns out Preston was fired for ethical violations, experimenting without proper protocols, falsifying data. That company specializes in treatments for PTSD and anxiety disorders." Thompson paused. "But here's the thing. They found records of 7 other dogs before your Ranger. Different breeds, different ages, all subjected to the same protocols." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the clinic's air conditioning. 7 others Diane mentioned seeing dogs coming and going, but not that many. Thompson nodded grimly. "According to the evidence, Preston's been doing this for years, long before he moved back to Willow Creek. Started with legitimate research, then went off the rails when his methods were rejected by mainstream science." "What happened to the other dogs?" Mason asked, already suspecting the answer. "None survived the experiment. Some were euthanized when they didn't respond as Preston wanted. Others died from complications similar to what Ranger experienced." Thompson cleared his throat. "Carlson said the autopsies showed evidence of extreme physical and psychological stress. What that man did, He trailed off, shaking his head. Mason looked down at Ranger, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep after eating. "He'll pay for it. Count on it." The animal cruelty charges alone would put him away for years, but they've found more evidence: tampering, practicing medicine without a license, fraud related to his research funding. Thompson hesitated. "And possibly worse. They're searching the property more thoroughly now, including ground-penetrating radar in certain areas." Carlson wouldn't say more over the phone. The implication hung in the air between them. Mason remembered Preston's cold detachment, his clinical discussions of subjects and protocols as if speaking of objects rather than living beings. If a man could view animals with such calculated cruelty, what else might he be capable of? "There's something else," Thompson said, his voice lower. "They found a file with your name on it in Preston's office. Detailed observations, medical history, notes about your PTSD symptoms, some of it going back years." Mason had seen the file during his break-in but hadn't had time to fully process its implications. He was watching me. Why? Carlson has a theory. Preston's research was supposedly aimed at developing treatments for trauma-related conditions. Your military background, your documented PTSD, you would have been a perfect test subject if his animal experiments had progressed to human trials. The realization settled like ice in Mason's veins. He looked at Ranger with new understanding. So, in Preston's mind, by rescuing Ranger, I wasn't just interfering with an experiment. You were stealing his proof of concept, Thompson finished, and possibly his ticket to recognition in the scientific community, twisted as that sounds. After the sheriff left, Mason sat beside Ranger's kennel, processing this new information. The idea that Preston had been watching him, planning to somehow use his trauma for these deranged experiments, added a layer of violation he hadn't anticipated. It also explained the intensity of Preston's reaction to Ranger's rescue. Mason had unwittingly disrupted plans years in the making. Sarah returned to check Ranger's vital signs, pleased with his continued improvement. His blood work is looking better, still elevated liver enzymes, but trending in the right direction. She glanced at Mason. You look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay? Mason debated how much to share, then decided Sarah deserved the full truth. As he related what Thompson had told him, her expression shifted from concern to horror. Human trials, she repeated. He was planning to use these same methods on people, on you specifically. Apparently so. Mason ran a hand through his hair, feeling suddenly exhausted. The worst part is, I can almost follow the twisted logic. If you view trauma as merely a maladaptive neurological pathway, then Preston's approach of systematic breakdown followed by recalibration makes a certain kind of sense. Except it ignores the fundamental humanity of the subject, Sarah said sharply. It's the approach of someone who sees others as mere biological mechanisms to be reprogrammed. Mason nodded, looking down at Ranger, who had awakened and was watching their conversation with alert eyes. The irony is, in some ways, Ranger and I were already helping each other heal, but through connection and trust, not whatever Preston had planned. Later that afternoon, Agent Carlson called with news that confirmed their worst suspicions. During the expanded search of Preston's property, investigators had discovered human remains buried in a remote corner of the land. The body was too decomposed for immediate identification, but preliminary examination suggested it had been there for at least 2 years. We're running DNA against missing persons databases, Carlson explained. Given Whitmore's research focus, we're looking particularly at veterans or others with documented PTSD who went missing in the region. The news sent ripples through Willow Creek's tight-knit community. Mason heard whispers when he went to the general store for supplies, saw the sideways glances from people who had dismissed his concerns about Preston weeks earlier. The Whitmore name, once spoken with deference, now carried a taint that even James Whitmore's considerable influence couldn't erase. James himself remained conspicuously absent from town, reportedly staying in Bozeman with relatives while cooperating with investigators. Rumors circulated about how much the father had known of his son's activities, whether the family construction business had been used to launder research funds or conceal evidence. 5 days after his crisis, Ranger was deemed stable enough to return home. He was still weak, requiring multiple medications and careful monitoring. But Sarah believed his recovery would progress better in a less clinical environment. Mason had spent the previous day preparing the cabin, creating a comfortable recovery space that would allow Ranger to rest while keeping him within sight at all times. The journey home was undertaken with extreme care. Ranger, though improved, remained fragile, his body depleted by the ordeal. Mason drove with uncharacteristic caution, taking the turns slowly, stopping once to offer water when Ranger seemed distressed. By the time they reached the cabin, the dog was exhausted but alert, his eyes tracking Mason's movements with increasing awareness. That night, Ranger slept on a specially prepared bed next to Mason's, close enough that Mason could reach down and touch his head whenever he stirred. The cabin's familiar sounds, the creak of settling wood, the distant call of owls, the whisper of wind through pines, seemed to soothe Ranger in ways the sterile clinic environment couldn't. Mason awoke before dawn to find Ranger watching him, those intelligent eyes more focused than they had been in days, with visible effort. The dog pushed himself up to a sitting position, his first time managing this unassisted since the crisis began. The simple action, a display of returning strength and determination, brought unexpected tears to Mason's eyes. "Good morning to you, too," he said softly, reaching out to gently stroke Ranger's head. The dog leaned slightly into the touch, another small victory on their long journey together. As the sun rose, painting the cabin with golden light, Mason moved through his morning routine with a sense of cautious optimism he hadn't felt in years. He prepared Ranger's medications, mixed them carefully into the special food Sarah had provided, and sat beside the dog's bed while he ate with gradually increasing enthusiasm. The ringing of his phone interrupted this peaceful moment. Mason answered to find Agent Carlson on the line, his tone grave. "We've identified the remains found on Whitmore's property," Carlson said without preamble. Michael Grayson, 35, former Army sergeant, reported missing 2 years ago after seeking treatment for severe PTSD. His family lost contact after he mentioned participating in a new therapy approach recommended by someone he met at a veterans support group. Mason closed his eyes, the name igniting immediate recognition. "I knew him. Not well, but we crossed paths at the VA in Bozeman a few times." "That fits our timeline," Carlson replied. "We believe Preston was targeting veterans specifically, using support groups and medical records to identify potential subjects. Grayson may have been his first attempt to transition from animal to human experimentation." The conversation continued, Carlson detailing evidence that suggested Preston had lured Grayson to Willow Creek with promises of revolutionary treatment, then implemented some version of his isolation and recalibration protocol. Something had gone wrong, whether Grayson had resisted or the protocol itself had failed wasn't yet clear. "Preston's being charged with second-degree murder," Carlson concluded. "His father is cooperating fully, claiming complete ignorance of his son's activities, though we're investigating financial connections." After hanging up, Mason sat in stunned silence, processing this final confirmation of Preston's depravity, the knowledge that he might have been intended as Preston's next subject, that he could have ended like Michael Grayson settled like a weight on his chest. A soft whine drew his attention back to Ranger, who had dragged himself closer, sensing Mason's distress. The dog's effort to provide comfort despite his own weakness struck Mason as profoundly moving, a display of empathy that Preston, for all his scientific pretensions, fundamentally lacked. "We're safe now," Mason told Ranger, gently stroking his healing back. "Both of us." As morning sunlight filled the cabin, Mason found himself thinking about the strange symmetry of their situation, how Ranger's rescue had potentially saved Mason from becoming Preston's next victim. how their parallel traumas had created a bond neither could have anticipated. There was something almost miraculous in how their broken pieces seemed to fit together, creating something stronger than either could have managed alone. 6 months later, Mason stood on the courthouse steps, Ranger sitting calmly at his side. The spring sun warmed the Montana air, melting the last patches of stubborn snow that had lingered in the shadows. Around them, a small crowd had gathered. Sarah, Sheriff Thompson, Diane Foster leaning on her cane, and a dozen others from Willow Creek who had come to witness this moment. Ranger looked like a different animal from the skeletal, terrified creature Mason had first discovered. His coat had grown in thick and glossy, the once infected skin now healthy beneath. He had filled out to a proper weight, muscle developing through careful exercise and nutrition. Most remarkable was the transformation in his eyes, alert, engaged, and showing a quiet confidence that had emerged gradually over months of patient rehabilitation. Mason bent down. Adjusting the special vest, Ranger now wore a service dog designation that had been earned through intensive training. "Ready, buddy?" he asked quietly. Ranger's tail swept once across the stone steps in response. Inside the courthouse, the adoption proceedings were brief but meaningful. Judge Eleanor Wilson, known for her no-nonsense approach to the law, allowed herself a rare smile as she reviewed the paperwork. "It seems all requirements have been met," she announced, looking over her reading glasses at Mason and Ranger. "The state of Montana formally relinquishes all claim to the animal previously designated as evidence in criminal case 2024 CR 189, now known as Ranger Hayes." She signed the document with a flourish. "Congratulations, Mr. Hayes. Legally, he's all yours." The small audience applauded as Mason knelt to embrace Ranger, who accepted the hug with dignified patience. It was a formality in many ways. Ranger had been his in every meaningful sense for months, but the official recognition felt important, a final severing of any connection to Preston Whitmore and his cruelty. Preston himself remained in custody awaiting trial, the charges against him having expanded as the investigation uncovered more evidence. Murder, animal cruelty, practicing medicine without a license, fraud, and numerous other counts ensured he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. His father, while cleared of direct involvement in his son's crimes, had been implicated in financial improprieties and faced his own legal troubles. "Never thought I'd see the day when a Whitmore actually faced consequences," Diane Foster remarked as they exited the courthouse. At 70, her health had declined over the winter, but her spirit remained undiminished. "My Harold would have appreciated the symmetry of it all." Mason smiled, offering his arm to help her navigate the steps. "Justice moves slowly sometimes, but it does move." Sheriff Thompson, who had arrived in his official capacity but stayed as a friend, nodded agreement. "Town's different now. People talk more, pay attention to things they used to ignore. Silver lining, I suppose." The group moved to the small park across from the courthouse, where Sarah had arranged a modest celebration, as people mingled, sharing refreshments and stories. Mason found himself standing slightly apart, watching Ranger interact confidently with the gathering. The dog moved with ease among the familiar faces, accepting gentle pats and offering his paw when requested, showing none of the fear that had once defined him. Sarah approached, handing Mason a cup of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts." "Just marveling at how far he's come," Mason replied, gesturing toward Ranger, who was now receiving enthusiastic attention from Sarah's young niece under the watchful eye of her parents. 6 months ago, I wasn't sure he'd survive, let alone thrive like this. He had good reason to fight, Sarah said, her gaze warm as it moved between man and dog. Over the months of Ranger's recovery, she had become more than a veterinarian to them both, a friend, a constant support, and gradually, something more that neither she nor Mason had yet fully defined. "We both did," Mason acknowledged. The changes in his own life had been no less profound, if less visible. The nightmares that had plagued him since his military service had diminished in both frequency and intensity. The isolation he had once sought now felt less necessary, replaced by a careful re-engagement with the community that had rallied around Ranger's recovery. The most significant change, however, had been the establishment of the Willow Creek Animal Rehabilitation Center. Using his modest military pension and a settlement from the Whitmore estate negotiated by the state as part of James Whitmore's plea agreement, Mason had purchased a small property on the edge of town. With Sarah's professional guidance and the volunteer support of several community members, they had created a specialized facility for abused and traumatized animals. Ranger had become an unofficial therapy assistant at the center, his calm presence somehow communicating to other traumatized animals that recovery was possible. The German Shepherd, who once cowered from human touch, now gently approached new rescues, demonstrating a sensitivity that no human could match. "Have you thought more about the therapy dog certification?" Sarah asked, watching as Ranger patiently allowed a small child to pat his head. "He has a natural gift for it." Mason nodded. "We start the formal training next month. The VA in Bozeman is already interested in having us visit once he's certified." The idea of Ranger helping veterans struggling with PTSD seemed fitting a way of honoring Michael Grayson and others who hadn't escaped Preston's cruelty. As the afternoon progressed, Mason found himself in conversation with Agent Carlson, who had driven from Helena for the occasion. The investigation into Preston's activities had officially concluded the previous month, though the legal proceedings would continue for years. "Thought you'd want to know," Carlson said quietly, moving away from the main group. "We've positively identified all 7 animals from Preston's records. Managed to locate 4 of the owner's people who reported their dogs missing over the past few years." Mason's jaw tightened. "Were they able to get closure? As much as possible under the circumstances. We held a small memorial service last week. Private. Just the families." Carlson hesitated. "Several of them asked about Ranger. They found some comfort knowing that at least one survived." Later, as the gathering dispersed and the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, Mason and Ranger walked the familiar path back to their cabin. The route took them past the property that had once belonged to Preston Whitmore, now owned by the county after asset forfeiture proceedings. The house stood empty, its windows dark, the infamous shed demolished months earlier. Mason had avoided this path during the early days of Ranger's recovery, concerned about triggering traumatic memories. Today, however, Ranger showed no distress as they passed, merely glancing briefly at the property before continuing forward. The past had not been forgotten, but its power had diminished. At home, Mason watched as Ranger completed his evening routine investigating the perimeter of the property, drinking from his water bowl, settling onto his bed near the fireplace with a contented sigh. These ordinary moments of domestic peace had become precious to Mason, each one a small victory over the darkness that had nearly claimed them both. After dinner, Mason sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Ranger resting beside his chair. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, stars beginning to appear as daylight faded. In the distance, The mountains stood as silent witnesses to the changing seasons, to life's continuous cycle of suffering and renewal. Mason's thoughts turned to Emily, as they often did in quiet moments. 6 years had passed since her death, the acute grief gradually transforming into a gentler, more bittersweet remembrance. He still visited her grave regularly, sometimes with Ranger beside him. During their last visit, he had found himself telling her about Sarah, about the rehabilitation center, about the unexpected new chapter that had opened in his life. "I think you would approve," he had said to the granite headstone, Ranger sitting respectfully at his side. "You always said I needed to let more light in." The fading light reminded Mason of a commitment he had almost forgotten. Rising from his chair, he went inside to retrieve a small box from the kitchen counter. Ranger followed curiously, watching as Mason opened it to reveal a carefully crafted cake suitable for canine consumption with a single candle. "Didn't think I'd forget." "Did you?" Mason asked, setting the cake on the floor. 1 year ago today, we found each other." The rescue anniversary had become an important milestone for them both, a day to acknowledge how far they had come. Mason lit the candle, its warm glow illuminating Ranger's attentive face. "Make a wish," he said softly, knowing the concept was lost on his companion but finding meaning in the ritual nonetheless. After a moment, Mason blew out the candle and removed it, allowing Ranger to enjoy his treat. As the dog ate with characteristic dignity, Mason thought about the strange paths that had brought them together, the cruelty that had nearly destroyed them both, and the healing they had found in each other's company. The landline phone rarely rang these days, most people preferring to call Mason's cell. The sudden shrill sound startled both man and dog. Mason answered to find Sarah on the line, her voice urgent but controlled. "Mason, we just got a call at the center. Police in Missoula found 3 dogs abandoned in horrific condition, signs of systematic abuse similar to what Ranger experienced." She paused. "They need somewhere that specializes in this kind of trauma. I told them we could help." "Of course," Mason replied without hesitation. "When will they arrive?" "Tomorrow morning. It's going to be challenging. One of them hasn't responded to any human contact yet." Another pause. "I thought maybe Ranger could help with the initial assessment. Sometimes it takes one who's been there." After arranging the details, Mason hung up and returned to where Ranger had finished his cake and was watching expectantly. "Looks like we have work to do tomorrow," he told the dog, who tilted his head attentively. "Some new friends who need to learn what you already know, that the darkness doesn't last forever." Outside, the last light of day had faded, stars now brilliantly visible across the vast Montana sky. Mason opened the door, and he and Ranger stepped onto the porch to enjoy the cool evening air. As they stood together in comfortable silence, Mason reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, the suffering that had connected them, and the healing they had found together. The path forward would not always be easy. Ranger still had moments of fear triggered by unexpected stimuli. Mason still had nights when the past intruded on the present. But they had each other now, and a purpose that had emerged from their shared trauma, helping other broken beings find their way back to wholeness. As if sensing his thoughts, Ranger pressed gently against Mason's leg, the warm weight of his body a silent affirmation of their bond. Mason rested his hand on the dog's head, feeling profound gratitude for this second chance they had both been given. "We made it, buddy," he said softly into the night. "We made it through." When darkness claims every corner of our world, sometimes salvation comes with 4 paws and unwavering loyalty. Ranger's journey from the shadows of cruelty to the light of compassion reminds us that it's never too late for a second chance, no matter how broken we may feel. For those of us who've weathered our own storms, lost loved ones, faced health challenges, or simply felt the weight of years making us invisible, this German Shepherd's resilience speaks directly to our hearts. Like Mason, many of us understand what it means to rebuild a life after tragedy, to find purpose when purpose seems lost. We recognize the healing power of giving and receiving care, especially when society tells us our usefulness has diminished. Ranger and Mason found in each other what we all seek: not perfection, but acceptance, not a life without scars, but the courage to live fully despite them. Their story whispers a truth we've earned the wisdom to hear, that our deepest wounds can become our greatest source of compassion for others. In our golden years, may we all find our own version of that cabin porch where, even as daylight fades, we can look back on our journey and softly affirm, we made it through.